The housekeeper's little girl tried to stay invisible, until she exposed a lie that nearly killed a billionaire, and changed both their lives forever. The Harrington mansion felt like another world to little Lily Brooks, a world full of polished marble floors, towering walls lined with art, and the soft gleam of chandeliers that burned from morning until night. She walked through it quietly, the way children who grew up among adults at work often learn to walk, light steps, careful breath, eyes wide and observant. Her mother, the housekeeper, had dressed her in a crisp white shirt, a neat red tie, and a simple black dress, telling her it would help her look important enough for such a grand place. Lily didn't feel important. She felt very small. But she liked being there, especially when she could read in the library or follow her mother around with a tiny dust cloth, pretending she was helping. That morning the house was unusually loud. Business partners had come for a private meeting with Mr. Thomas Harrington, and the entire staff had been instructed to maintain absolute silence. Lily tried her best, clutching a stack of napkins her mother handed her, hoping she could be useful. When the meeting ended and the guests left, she followed her mother into the main hall, watching adults rush around with trays and folders, their voices a mixture of whispers and annoyance. It was then that she heard it, a sharp, almost mocking tone drifting from the staircase. Lily's feet stopped on their own. She recognized the voice instantly, Jake Weller, the billionaire's young assistant. He always walked with the fast, rushed arrogance of someone who thought the whole world was beneath him. She could see only his shoes from where she stood, but his words echoed clearly through the hall. If the old man weren't so clueless, Jake muttered, unaware of anyone listening, he'd stop pretending he's still running this company. He should retire before he embarrasses himself even more. Lily's breath caught. She clutched the napkins against her chest, her heart racing. She knew Jake was talking about Mr. Harrington. Everyone did. And Lily knew Mr. Harrington too, not the businessman, not the billionaire people whispered about, but the kindly older gentleman who always greeted her first when he came downstairs. When her mother cleaned the library, he would kneel beside her little chair and ask what she was reading, or offer her a small piece of caramel candy he kept hidden in his desk. He listened to her, even though she was just a child, and she adored him for it. Hearing someone insult him felt wrong. It made the hallway colder, the air sharper, like the house itself didn't approve. Jake didn't notice her. He walked away toward the study, still grumbling under his breath. Lily's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him to stop, to say something brave, but the words stuck. She was only 5. Adults didn't listen to her. Her mother often warned her not to interrupt grown-up conversations, not to interfere in things that didn't concern her. She tried to obey, even now, even though her heart buzzed with something she couldn't name. Fear. Anger. The desire to protect someone kind. Her mother called from across the hall. Lily forced herself to move again, though her legs felt shaky. She carried the napkins into the dining room and set them on the table, trying to focus on the work. But Jake's voice kept replaying in her head. Old. Clueless. Should retire. Should step aside. The words felt like scratches against the truth she knew. Moments later, footsteps echoed down the stairs, the slow, steady, familiar rhythm of Mr. Harrington himself. He appeared in the hall wearing a refined blue suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his blue eyes soft but tired. He looked older today, Lily realized. He looked like someone who carried heavy thoughts. He didn't see her at first. He was focused on adjusting his cufflinks, on breathing through whatever stress he held inside. And then Lily made a decision. A small, terrified, important decision. She stepped out from behind the table and ran toward him, stopping right in front of him, so abruptly that he nearly startled. She craned her neck to look up at him, her tiny hands curled into fists at her sides. "Mr. Harrington," she said, but her voice broke halfway through his name. His expression softened immediately. "Lily? What is it, dear." Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. The words she had been holding spilled out in a trembling rush, carried by instinct rather than courage. "He's lying," she whispered. He calls you old and stupid." Silence followed. The kind that freezes a moment in place and refuses to let it escape. Thomas Harrington stared down at Lily, blindsided not by the insult, he'd lived long enough to expect them, but by the fact that this tiny girl had stood here shaking, yet still chose to tell him. A tremor of disbelief crossed his face, followed by something deeper, something warmer, something almost protective. He knew she hadn't lied. Lily was too honest, too young, too afraid to invent something like that. Behind them, down the hall, Jake had gone rigid, his face draining of all color. Lily didn't look at him. She stayed focused on Mr. Harrington, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the world to fall apart, waiting for something she couldn't predict. But all the billionaire did was kneel slowly so that his eyes met hers. "Thank you for telling me, Lily," he said quietly, with a calm so gentle it made her want to cry. And in that single moment, without knowing it, she changed everything. The shock of Lily's words lingered in the air long after she spoke them, settling like a cloud that neither she nor Mr. Harrington could brush away. Thomas remained kneeling in front of her, searching her face for even the smallest hint of uncertainty, but all he found was a trembling child trying her best not to cry. Her honesty radiated through every tiny movement, the way she clutched her dress, the way her chin quivered, the way her wide blue eyes flicked nervously between him and the floor. She wasn't trying to gain favor or attention, she was simply unable to keep the truth inside. Slowly, Thomas stood up, his knees protesting slightly. Age had its way of reminding him of limits he refused to acknowledge. His gaze drifted over Lily's head toward the hallway where Jake was still frozen. The assistant straightened his posture, forced a polite expression, and walked toward them as if nothing unusual had happened. But even from a distance, it was obvious something in his composure had cracked. The arrogant confidence he always carried slipped around the edges, revealing panic beneath. "Sir," Jake began, trying to steady his voice, "I'm not sure what this child thinks she heard, but—" Thomas raised a hand, the gesture sharp enough to silence him instantly. Lily flinched, instinctively expecting the anger to be aimed at her, but Thomas turned back to her first. "Lily," he said gently, "you can go find your mother now." "Thank you." Her lips parted as if she wanted to ask whether she'd done something wrong, but instead she nodded and backed away, her shoes tapping lightly against the polished floor. She disappeared around the corner, leaving the two men alone. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture or scold. He simply looked at Jake with a quiet, heavy disappointment that carried far more weight than anger ever could. "You've worked next to me for 3 years," he said, his tone low and firm. 3 years, Jake. And you speak about me like that in my own home." Jake swallowed, his throat bobbing in desperation. "Sir, I was frustrated. It was a moment of carelessness. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," Thomas cut him off. "Carelessness reveals truth, Jake. It doesn't hide it." For a moment Jake dropped the polite mask entirely. His eyes hardened. His jaw clenched. He looked like a man who realized he had been caught and didn't have the grace to apologize. But then the expression smoothed into something practiced and artificial. "I'm loyal to you," he insisted, pushing a hand to his chest. "You know that. I would never sabotage your reputation or leadership." Thomas almost laughed, but it came out as a tired exhale instead. "You already have," he murmured. The conversation ended without theatrics. Thomas dismissed Jake with a quiet, "You may go home for today," and the younger man walked away stiffly, his shoes tapping in an uneven rhythm. But Thomas didn't return to his office. Instead, he walked toward the library, a place that always helped him think. The room welcomed him with its warm lamplight and rows of books that had seen more years than he had. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, letting the stillness sink in. He had expected betrayal from competitors, board members, and strangers. But not from the young man he mentored. Not from someone he had given responsibility, opportunity, and trust. Sometimes age brought wisdom, other times it brought vulnerability. And today, he felt both. He sat down heavily in his favorite armchair and pressed his hand over his eyes. The weariness wasn't just physical. It was the feeling of watching the world shift under his feet and realizing he could not stand as firmly as he once did. Yet, unexpectedly, a small voice echoed in his mind. He calls you old and stupid. The memory of Lily's trembling honesty softened the tension in his chest. She had spoken up even though she was terrified. She could have stayed silent, pretended she heard nothing, and no one would have blamed her. But instead she stood up for him, something so few adults had done lately. He lowered his hand and stared at the crackling fireplace. A child defended him when grown men conspired against him. The contrast struck him with surprising force. After several minutes, he stood up again, his steps slower but more deliberate. Lily had returned to the staff area by now. He wanted to speak to her properly, without Jake's shadow looming over them. When he reached the small room where the staff took breaks, he saw her sitting alone on a chair too big for her, her feet dangling just above the floor. She was staring at her hands, twisting the hem of her dress nervously. She looked up quickly when she heard the door open, her eyes widening in fear that he might be angry. Thomas approached her with a warm, reassuring smile, something gentle enough to melt the tension in her small shoulders. "Lily," he said, taking a seat beside her so he wouldn't tower over her, "you did something very brave today." She shook her head immediately. "I wasn't brave. I was scared." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he replied softly. "It's choosing to do the right thing even when you're frightened." Her eyes shimmered. No one had ever explained it to her like that. No one had ever made her feel that telling the truth could be something beautiful instead of dangerous. He reached into his pocket and handed her a caramel candy, the kind he always kept for her. She hesitated, then took it quietly. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded, studying her delicate face, the honesty in her gaze, the innocence that hadn't yet been corrupted by the adult world. Something inside him settled. Something else awakened, a protective instinct he didn't quite expect. If a child could risk discomfort to defend him, then he owed her more than a simple thank you. And though he didn't yet know how deeply that promise would shape their futures, he felt it forming in his heart as clearly as if it had already been spoken. Lily did not sleep well that night. She lay on the thin cot in the small staff bedroom beside her mother, feeling every crease in the blanket and every thump of her heartbeat. The house was quiet except for the hum of distant heaters and the occasional creak of the old wood, but her thoughts were louder than any noise the mansion could make. She kept replaying the moment in the hallway, the way Mr. Harrington looked at her with gentle surprise, the way Jake's face twisted with anger and fear, and the way her own voice shook like a leaf caught in a storm. She worried she had ruined something important. She worried her mother would lose her job. She worried that telling the truth had been a mistake, even though she knew deep inside it wasn't. Her mother wasn't asleep either. She listened to Lily shifting restlessly, her small breaths uneven. Finally, she reached over and gently smoothed the girl's hair. She didn't ask questions, but Lily felt the comfort of the touch and curled closer, trying to believe everything would be fine. Meanwhile, in another part of the mansion, Thomas Harrington sat awake in his study. The fireplace had burned down to embers, casting the room in an amber glow that flickered across his thoughtful face. Age had never bothered him, but betrayal did. The words Jake had spoken echoed through him like a bruise that refused to fade. He wondered how long Jake had felt that way, how often he had spoken behind his back, how many of his decisions had been undermined by the very person meant to support him. But each time the bitterness rose, Lily's voice pushed through it, small, shaky, sincere. He realized how much courage it must have taken for her to speak up, especially at her age, especially knowing she came from a family whose livelihood relied on him. He had seen adults twice her size stay silent to protect their comfort, yet she had stepped forward with nothing but honesty. When morning arrived, the mansion woke slowly. Staff brewed coffee, opened curtains, and returned the home to its usual rhythm. Lily followed her mother into the kitchen, holding tightly to her small notebook, something she often doodled in when no one was watching. She walked with her head lowered, afraid of glances, afraid of whispers, afraid of seeing Jake and the shadow of yesterday's confrontation. She shouldn't have worried. Jake didn't come back that morning. His absence felt like a stain in the mansion, a reminder of what had happened. But the staff didn't know the details, they only sensed that tension floated in the air. Lily couldn't hide her fear all day. Her movements were clumsy, her steps uncertain. She bumped into a chair carrying folded towels and apologized 3 times, even though no one was upset. Her mother noticed, of course, but she didn't pressure her. She simply whispered, "It will be all right," though even she sounded unsure. Later that afternoon, as Lily helped wipe the library tables, the door opened, and Thomas stepped inside. She froze. The cloth slipped from her hands and landed on the floor with a soft thud. She bent to pick it up, but he stopped her gently. "You don't always need to work, you know," he said with a small smile meant to ease her nerves. "You're just a child." Lily stood still, unsure if she should smile back. Thomas walked toward her slowly, careful not to intimidate her. The library light caught the silver strands in his hair and softened the lines on his face, making him look less like the powerful billionaire everyone feared and more like a tired man who had seen too much in one lifetime. "Lily," he began, lowering himself onto one knee so he was level with her again. "I want to talk to you." Those were the words she had been terrified of hearing all day. She swallowed hard and hugged the notebook to her chest as if it could shield her. "I didn't mean to make trouble," she blurted out. "I wasn't spying. I didn't, I didn't want him to be mean to you." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she stared at the carpet. Thomas frowned, not out of annoyance, but out of concern for how long she must have been carrying this fear. "You didn't make trouble," he said firmly. "You prevented it." She looked up at him, confusion mixing with relief. "You told me something I needed to know," he continued. "Something I might never have learned if you hadn't spoken." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I want you to know how proud I am of you." Lily blinked at him, unprepared for praise. "Proud?" "Very," he said. "You were brave. And honest. 2 things adults often forget how to be." Her eyes shimmered, and her lip trembled again, but this time not from fear. He stood and walked to a nearby shelf, pulling down a beautifully bound book with gold edges. "Do you like stories?" he asked, offering it to her. She hesitated before nodding. "I love them." "Good," he said. "This one is for you. I want you to read it whenever you feel scared or unsure. Stories remind us that courage comes in all sizes." She took the book slowly, running her fingers along the smooth cover as if it were a treasure she had never dreamed of owning. Her awe made Thomas smile in a way he hadn't smiled in months. Just then her mother arrived at the door, startled to see Lily holding something so expensive. Before she could apologize or make her daughter give it back, Thomas reassured her. "She's earned it," he said gently. As Lily stepped into the hallway, she felt something shift inside her. Yesterday she had been small and frightened and invisible. Today, someone powerful had listened to her, believed her, valued her. And though she didn't understand the full meaning yet, this moment was planting the seed of a bond that would grow far deeper than anything either of them expected. That night the mansion felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves sensed something had shifted beneath their polished surface. The corridors, normally buzzing with quiet, efficient movement, seemed strangely tense, and though Lily was too young to articulate it, she felt the weight in the air like a storm building behind a dark cloud. Her mother worked late, cleaning the upper floors, and Lily tried to stay busy coloring in her little notebook, but her mind kept drifting to the book Mr. Harrington had given her. She placed it beside her like a guardian, occasionally touching the cover just to reassure herself it was real. The thought that someone as important as Mr. Harrington believed her had warmed her more deeply than she understood, yet the fear of Jake lingered at the back of her mind like an unwelcome shadow. Meanwhile, Jake walked through the mansion's silent hallways with a bitterness he no longer tried to mask. His pride had always been his armor, and Lily's revelation had pierced it in a way he couldn't forgive. His dismissal earlier that day, even though temporary, felt like humiliation. And humiliation was something Jake had never tolerated well. He paced the hall outside the study, muttering under his breath, replaying the moment he saw the billionaire looking at him with disappointment instead of trust. He clenched and unclenched his fists, his thoughts spiraling into darker regions the longer he brooded. Thomas Harrington may have been aging, but he had never been naive. Jake, on the other hand, was impulsive, and when impulsive people were angry, they became unpredictable. Jake told himself that the child had exaggerated, misinterpreted, lied, but deep down he knew the truth. She had told the exact words he had spoken, and because of her, everything he had been working toward, the influence, the inheritance he imagined he might one day gain, now trembled on shaky ground. As night deepened, Jake's anger hardened into a reckless idea. If his career was at risk because of a single incident, then he needed to regain control of the narrative. And the fastest way to do that, in his mind, was to ensure that Thomas Harrington remained dependent on him. He knew the billionaire's medical conditions well, he had access to his medication schedule, his doctor's notes, and the list of prescriptions. Jake convinced himself he wasn't doing anything terrible, just nudging fate a little, protecting his position before anyone else threatened it further. Jealousy, self-preservation, and ambition twisted together until he felt justified. The house was asleep when Jake slipped into the study. The door eased open with a soft creak. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting shadows across the wooden desk and shelves filled with thick leather-bound books. Jake knew exactly where the pills were kept, in a drawer Thomas had always assumed only he touched. Jake moved quickly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. He replaced the bottle with one identical in appearance but vastly different in consequence. He told himself it was just a scare, a way to make Thomas realize how much he relied on him. He convinced himself he wasn't truly hurting anyone. People who do wrong rarely believe they are villains in the moment they act. But Jake didn't know he was being watched. Lily had woken up thirsty and slipped quietly through the hallway toward the kitchen, clutching her small cup. She wasn't used to the mansion's nighttime silence, and every sound felt larger and more mysterious. As she tiptoed past the study, she noticed a sliver of light beneath the door. Something urged her to look inside, not curiosity, but instinct, the same quiet sense that had told her to speak up the day before. She stood on her toes and peered through the barely open doorway. Her breath hitched. She recognized Jake immediately, saw the way he handled the medication bottles, the way he placed one back with suspicious precision. Even at her age, she knew what it meant when someone replaced one thing with another. The memory of him whispering cruel words about Mr. Harrington flashed through her mind. She stepped back quickly, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might echo. Her small fingers tightened around the cup until it almost cracked. She knew she should run, should find her mother, should tell someone, but terror kept her glued to the spot for several seconds. Jake finally closed the drawer softly and exited on the opposite side of the room, unaware she had seen everything. Lily waited until his footsteps faded down the hall, then pressed her hands over her mouth to stop herself from crying. The danger felt larger than anything she had ever faced. Someone she barely knew had insulted a man she admired, and now that same person had done something, she didn't know what exactly, but it was something bad, something that made her stomach twist with dread. She tiptoed away and rushed back to the staff bedroom, where her mother was still folding towels. Lily's face was pale, her movements frantic, and her mother immediately knelt to hold her shoulders. "What's wrong?" she whispered, smoothing Lily's hair. But Lily only shook her head, too scared to speak, clutching her mother as if the world were falling apart. In the study, the drawer containing the switched medication remained closed, silent, and deadly. Upstairs, the billionaire slept unaware of the danger Jake had left waiting for him. And in a small bedroom, a frightened child lay awake with the unbearable knowledge that something terrible was coming. The housekeeper's daughter didn't yet understand the full magnitude of what she had witnessed. She didn't yet know the consequences of remaining silent or the bravery it would take to speak again. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity: Mr. Harrington was not safe. And this time, the truth she held could mean the difference between life and death. Morning arrived with a deceptive calm, the kind that settles over a house right before something goes terribly wrong. Pale winter light streamed through the tall windows of the Harrington mansion, landing gently across the rugs and gilded furniture as though the world expected the day to be ordinary. Lily wasn't fooled. She had barely slept, her tiny hands trembling whenever she remembered Jake in the study, the quiet clink of medication bottles, the way he had moved like someone with a dark purpose. She followed her mother down the hall, clutching her notebook against her chest as if it were armor. Her mother brushed her hair aside lovingly and told her she looked pale, but Lily didn't know how to explain what she had seen. She was terrified, terrified she might be wrong, terrified she might be right, terrified of what might happen if she said nothing or if she said everything. Fear knotted inside her, too heavy for such a small body to carry. Meanwhile, Thomas Harrington was beginning his morning the way he always did, slowly, with a brief moment of stillness before letting the world back in. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing a hand over his face, before reaching for the glass of water and pill bottle on his bedside table. His routine was ingrained into his bones. He didn't question the pills, didn't consider the possibility that something as familiar as his medication could be dangerous. He swallowed them with a sigh, unaware that what he had taken was not the prescription that kept his heart steady. The effect wasn't immediate. At first it was just a faint tightness in his chest, something he brushed aside as fatigue, but it lingered, like an invisible hand pressing lightly against him. Lily and her mother walked past the grand staircase just as Thomas appeared at the top. He rested his hand against the railing, pausing mid-step. His face paled in a way she had never seen before. Lily froze. Her heart split wide with fear. It was happening. Whatever Jake had done, whatever she had seen, it was taking effect. She tugged on her mother's arm, but her mother didn't understand the urgency in her eyes, not until Thomas's steps faltered again. Within minutes the mansion erupted into chaos. Thomas collapsed onto a hallway bench, his breath ragged, his hand trembling violently as he clutched his chest. Staff rushed toward him, shouting for water, for cold towels, for someone to call emergency services. Lily watched from a few feet away, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She felt the same crushing terror she had felt the night before, but stronger, sharper, wrapped in guilt. She hadn't said anything. She had let fear trap her voice inside her throat. As two staff members tried to steady Thomas, Lily finally broke free from her mother's arms and ran toward the doctors who had just arrived with medical bags and purposeful strides. They knelt beside the billionaire, quickly checking his pulse, his breathing, his pupils. Their calm professionalism only made the panic in her chest grow. "Wait!" Lily cried, her voice cracking. "There's something wrong, he didn't take the right medicine." The words burst out of her like an explosion, unstoppable and desperate. The doctors paused, glancing at her with initial confusion, but something in her expression, raw and terrified, made them hesitate. One of them leaned an inch closer. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Lily swallowed hard, wiping her tears with the back of her sleeve. "I saw, last night, he went into the study, and he changed something in the drawer. He switched the bottles. It wasn't the same. It wasn't the right one. Her voice shook, her breaths shallow and fast. The room went silent around her for a moment, staff turning to stare with growing alarm. The doctor exchanged a tense look with his colleague, then stood abruptly and asked the head housekeeper to lead him to the study. Within minutes he returned, clutching 2 identical pill bottles, but one had a pharmacy label that didn't match Thomas's medical records. "We need to treat him immediately," the doctor barked, snapping into action. "This is a medication error, potentially intentional." A medic administered the antidote while another prepared Thomas for immediate transport. His breathing steadied only slightly, his voice faint but audible as he tried to speak. "Lily," he whispered, searching the room for her. She ran to his side without thinking, taking his hand in both of hers. His fingers were cold, frighteningly cold, but he squeezed back with as much strength as he could muster. "You told them," he murmured, and for a moment his eyes softened with an emotion she couldn't name. "I had to," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to get hurt. I didn't want something bad to happen." Her tears fell onto his hand, tiny drops warm against his cooling skin. Thomas looked at her the way someone might look at a miracle, fragile, small, unexpected, but powerful enough to change everything. The medics wheeled him away, and Lily stood trembling as the doors closed behind him. Her mother knelt and hugged her tightly, whispering that she had done the right thing, that she had been brave, that she had saved him. But Lily could barely absorb the words through her tears. The weight of what she had witnessed and the knowledge of how close he had come to dying left her shaking uncontrollably. While the mansion fell into frantic movement, and while police officers arrived to investigate the medication tampering, Lily remained near the entrance, staring through the glass as the ambulance disappeared down the road. She hugged the book Thomas had given her against her chest as if it held the strength she lacked. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew that the truth she spoke today had mattered. She had saved him once. And she prayed it would be enough. The ride to the hospital felt like forever, even though Lily wasn't inside the ambulance. She sat in the back seat of a staff member's car with her mother beside her, her small hands gripping the seatbelt so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sirens ahead wailed through the cold morning air, each pulse reminding her of the man who might not make it to the next minute. Her chest ached with guilt and fear, and she kept whispering tiny prayers, hoping someone, anyone, was listening. Her mother tried to comfort her, rubbing her back, telling her she'd done the right thing, but Lily couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harrington clinging to consciousness, his breath thin, his eyes glassy. She wondered if he knew how scared she was, if he understood she had wanted to warn him sooner. At the hospital, nurses rushed Thomas into a bright white hallway while doctors shouted instructions. Lily tried to follow, but her mother stopped her gently and pointed her toward a waiting area. The chairs were stiff and cold, and the ticking clock on the wall made every second feel heavier than the last. People came and went, nurses pushing carts, doctors carrying charts, other families whispering urgently, but for Lily the world was reduced to a single question that burned unbearably in her mind. What if she hadn't spoken in time? What if he didn't wake up? The thought made her stomach twist painfully. Her mother left briefly to speak with one of the nurses, who recognized her from the patient directory. Lily stayed alone in the waiting room, her legs dangling off the chair, her book from Mr. Harrington pressed firmly against her chest. She opened it, tried to read, tried to lose herself in the stories he said would bring her courage. But the letters danced and blurred behind her tears. Every page reminded her of him, of his kindness, of the way he'd knelt to speak to her, of the trust in his eyes when she told the truth. She wondered if he knew how important he had become to her, how much she wanted him to be safe. A doctor finally entered the waiting room, scanning for familiar faces. When he spotted Lily's mother, he approached with a solemn expression that made Lily's breath catch. The woman set a hand on Lily's shoulder, and both turned toward him, bracing for whatever news he carried. The doctor spoke carefully, explaining that Thomas had suffered a severe reaction due to the switched medication, but that they had managed to stabilize him. The antidote had worked quickly, but the damage could have been catastrophic if they had waited longer. He assured them the timing had been critical, and that whoever alerted them had saved the man's life. Lily's mother exhaled with relief, but Lily's legs nearly gave out from under her. She wobbled forward, tears spilling before she could stop them. The doctor knelt, sensing the source of her distress, and spoke gently. "He is alive because someone very brave spoke up," he said, not knowing exactly who that someone was. But Lily knew. She wrapped her arms around her mother's waist and cried into her coat, the fear finally breaking loose after hours of being held inside like a storm. When they were allowed to see Thomas through the observation window, Lily peeked over the sill. He lay in the hospital bed, pale and still, with wires on his chest and machines tracking each heartbeat. Seeing him like that made her tremble, but it also steeled something within her. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had done this. Someone had meant to hurt him. She thought of Jake's face, cold, spiteful, twisted with resentment, and a shiver crawled down her back. She hadn't fully understood the seriousness of what he'd done until that moment. A police officer arrived shortly after, requesting to speak with Lily and her mother. Lily felt her stomach drop. She wasn't used to talking to strangers, let alone someone in uniform. But the officer knelt down, softening his voice, asking only simple questions. Lily described what she had seen in the study, how Jake had replaced one bottle with another, how he behaved afterward. Her words shook, but she forced them out, each one pushing through fear like a flower breaking through frozen soil. The officer listened carefully, writing everything down. Her mother watched with teary pride, unable to believe how courageous her little girl had become. When the interview ended, Lily walked back to the window again and looked at Thomas's motionless form. Her heart tightened, but this time it wasn't just fear, it was determination. She wanted him to wake up, not because it would ease her guilt, but because she cared deeply for him in a way she hadn't realized until seeing him like this. She pressed her small hand against the glass, her breath fogging the window. "Please get better," she whispered, barely audible. "Please." Her mother lifted her and carried her to a quiet corner of the room, letting her rest her head against her shoulder. Lily closed her eyes but refused to sleep, listening to the beeping of distant machines through the wall. She imagined Thomas hearing her voice somehow, imagined him knowing he wasn't alone. She imagined him waking up. And though she didn't know it then, though she couldn't see the future or understand the depth of the bond that had begun forming between them, her courage had already changed his fate. Her voice had saved him. And soon, it would change everything else. The hospital felt different the next morning, quieter in a way that made every sound seem sharper. Nurses moved carefully through the halls, their shoes whispering across polished floors. The lights overhead hummed softly. Machines beeped in steady patterns that sounded like distant metronomes holding the building together. Lily sat curled in the same chair where she had spent the night, her head buried against her mother's side. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time she dozed off, she jolted awake with the same fearful thought that maybe something had changed while she was unconscious. Maybe he had gotten worse. Maybe she hadn't spoken soon enough. Her mother stroked her hair, whispering that Mr. Harrington was stable now, that the doctors were taking good care of him, but Lily still felt as if her heart was balancing on the edge of a cliff. When a nurse finally approached them with a small smile, Lily's breath caught. "He's awake," she said gently, and those two words seemed to melt the stiffness in Lily's tiny shoulders. She slid off the chair so fast she nearly tripped, gripping her mother's hand as they followed the nurse down the hallway. Her pulse thumped loudly in her ears, muffling everything else. She didn't know what to expect, what he would look like, how he would sound, whether he would even want to see her, but the thought of turning back never crossed her mind. She needed to see him. She needed to know with her own eyes that he was still there. Thomas lay propped against several pillows when they entered the room, his skin still pale but no longer ghostly. His eyes were half open, heavy-lidded with fatigue, but when he noticed the small figure in the doorway, something softened in his expression. He lifted a hand slightly, a slow, tired gesture, but enough to show he recognized her. Lily froze, overwhelmed with relief. Her mother nudged her forward gently, and the girl took small, hesitant steps toward the bed. She stopped beside him, clutching the railing with both hands as though anchoring herself. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered, her voice trembling. His lips curved into a faint smile. "Lily," he responded, barely louder than a breath. "You're here." Tears pricked her eyes instantly. She nodded, swallowing hard. "You scared me," she admitted, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. I thought maybe you wouldn't." She couldn't finish. Her throat tightened painfully. Thomas reached out his hand, struggling a little, and she took it with both of hers, letting his fingers rest inside her small palms. "You saved me," he said quietly, and even though his voice was weak, the certainty in it was strong enough to silence every doubt she had carried. "If you hadn't spoken, I don't think I would be here right now." Lily shook her head as if she didn't deserve the praise. "I was scared," she whispered. "I wanted to tell you earlier, but I was too afraid." "Courage doesn't mean you weren't afraid," Thomas answered, squeezing her hand gently. "It means you didn't let fear win." Her lip quivered. She tried to speak again but found her voice trapped. Instead, she climbed carefully onto the chair beside his bed, still holding on to him. He let her sit as close as she wanted, his eyes watching her with a tenderness that surprised even himself. He had built whole empires, defeated ruthless competitors, faced ruthless markets, but nothing in his life had ever struck him with such unexpected force as this little girl's loyalty. Her mother stood respectfully near the door, wiping her eyes without hiding it. She had been terrified too, but Lily had carried the heaviest burden, holding the secret, carrying the guilt, pushing herself to speak. Thomas nodded gratefully to the woman, silently thanking her for raising a child with such unwavering honesty. A doctor entered the room to check Thomas's vitals, but even while he spoke about recovery plans and precautions, Thomas's eyes rarely left Lily. She listened carefully, absorbing every word even though most of it made little sense to her. She only cared about one thing: he was going to be okay. The danger she had feared all night was passing, the nightmare loosening its grip. When the doctor left, the room grew quiet again. Lily let out a long, shaky breath and rested her head against the side of the bed, keeping her hand around his. Thomas stroked her hair weakly, as though soothing a frightened kitten. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured. "Not anymore." She didn't question what he meant. She didn't need to. Something in his voice, something soft, protective, certain, wrapped around her heart like a promise. For the first time since the night before, she didn't feel like the world was falling apart. But while Lily felt the fear fading, Thomas felt something else awakening. He had nearly died. Someone had tried to harm him deliberately. And only one small child had seen the truth. He glanced toward the doorway where two police officers were waiting to speak with him. A shadow passed through his gaze, a flicker of anger and betrayal, but he pushed it aside long enough to focus on Lily again. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he told her, brushing a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "I won't let anything happen to you. You've done more for me than you will ever know." Her eyes widened slightly, unsure what he meant, but comforted all the same. She squeezed his hand tighter, her small fingers warm against his cold skin. Thomas realized then that he cared for her far more deeply than he had realized. She wasn't just the housekeeper's daughter. She was the reason he was alive. She was the person who saw truth when no one else did. And she was the one who had looked at him not as a billionaire or a powerful figure, but as a man who needed to be protected. In that hospital room, with monitors beeping softly around them, a bond stronger than fear or circumstance settled quietly between them, an unspoken connection that neither of them could name yet, but both felt deeply. And as Lily leaned a little closer, letting her eyes finally close from exhaustion, Thomas knew this moment was only the beginning of something far greater than either of them understood. The following days moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the world itself had paused to let Thomas recover. Lily visited the hospital every afternoon, clutching the book he'd given her on the first day, her steps light but purposeful. Each time she entered his room, Thomas felt the atmosphere brighten just enough to dismiss the gloom settling behind the machines and monitors. He had never imagined that a small child's presence could bring him comfort, yet here she was, arriving with her shy smile, her quiet loyalty, and the sincerity adults often forgot how to show. Her mother came with her, always apologetic about taking up space, but Thomas insisted they stay as long as they wished. He even arranged for them to be escorted through private entrances so the press wouldn't notice their visits. He had already given enough of his life to the public eye. Lily, he felt, deserved protection from it. One afternoon, as winter sun slanted through the hospital blinds, painting narrow golden stripes across the bed, Thomas motioned for Lily to sit beside him. She climbed onto the chair, pulling her legs under her like a small bird perching on a branch. He watched her flip through the pages of the book he'd given her, her lips moving silently as she read. He admired how she focused, how her small brow furrowed whenever she came across a word she didn't know. Eventually she closed the book and looked up. "Are you still sick?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head gently. "I'm getting stronger. Thanks to you." She pressed her lips together as if trying to hold in her emotions. "I don't want you to go away." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, placing his hand over hers. "And I want to make sure you never feel alone again either." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded solemnly, as though accepting a pact neither of them had spoken aloud. But their moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. 2 police officers entered, their expressions serious. Lily stiffened instantly, clutching Thomas's hand with sudden panic. He squeezed back, a protective instinct rising sharply inside him. "It's all right," he assured her softly. "They're here to talk, not to hurt anyone." Her mother stepped forward to stand beside her, shielding her with gentle hands on her shoulders. The officers spoke respectfully, explaining that the investigation was progressing quickly. They had already reviewed security footage and matched Lily's account with the evidence. Her bravery had guided them to the truth. Jake had been arrested earlier that morning, caught attempting to flee the city after realizing the police were searching for him. When the officers mentioned Jake's name, Lily's grip tightened in fear, but Thomas placed a steady hand against her back. "You're safe," he murmured. "He can't come near you again." The officers confirmed this, adding that Jake would face charges not only for tampering with medication but also for endangering a life. After they left, Lily remained tense, her shoulders trembling beneath her little coat. Thomas sighed softly and lifted his arm to invite her closer. She crawled onto the bed with childlike instinct and curled against his side, her head resting carefully so she wouldn't disturb the wires and tubes. Her mother fumbled with apologies, but Thomas shook his head and motioned for her to let the girl stay. "She's had enough fear for one lifetime," he said. "Let her feel safe." Gradually, Lily's breathing steadied. She listened to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, matching her breaths to the sound until her muscles finally relaxed. Thomas looked down at her, feeling something powerful settle inside him, a sense of responsibility, affection, and gratitude that surprised even him. It wasn't the distant fondness of a man grateful to a child. It was deeper. Protective. Connected. The following day, Thomas requested that Lily and her mother join him in a private conference room at the hospital. Lily sat stiffly in her chair, not understanding why they were there. Her mother tried to mask her nervousness but failed. She squeezed Lily's hand tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Thomas entered with a small stack of papers in his hands, he smiled at them gently, a smile that held meaning rather than formality. "I've made a decision," he began, sitting across from them. "A decision I should have made long ago, even before all of this happened." Lily blinked at him, her legs dangling off the chair. "You both have given me something no money can buy," he continued. "Honesty. Loyalty. Kindness. I want to give something back, not out of obligation, but because you deserve it." Her mother looked confused. "Mr. Harrington, you don't owe us anything." He shook his head. "On the contrary. I owe your daughter my life." He placed the papers on the table and slid them toward her mother. "I want Lily to attend the best private school in the state. Full scholarship. All expenses covered. Supplies, transportation, tutoring, everything." Her mother's breath caught, her eyes widening in disbelief. Lily stared blankly, unsure what a scholarship meant, but recognizing the emotion on her mother's face. "And," Thomas added softly, glancing at Lily, "I want to help you both move out of the staff quarters. I've arranged a safe apartment close to the school. It's yours for as long as you want it." Lily's mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears pooling instantly. We. "Mr. Harrington, this is too much. You've already—" "It's not too much," he interrupted gently. "It's the least I can do." He leaned forward slightly, directing his gaze at Lily. "You saw what no one else did. You spoke when no one else would. And you protected me when I couldn't protect myself. People like you deserve every opportunity life can offer." Lily looked at him with wide, astonished eyes, her heart swelling with confusion and emotion she couldn't name. Slowly, she stood from her chair and walked toward him. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around him in the most earnest embrace anyone had ever given him. He hugged her back with careful strength, feeling his eyes sting unexpectedly. In that moment, he understood something profound. This child had changed the course of his life. And he was determined to change the course of hers. Spring arrived slowly, almost shyly, as if the world needed time to recover from the winter that had nearly taken Thomas Harrington's life. The snow melted from the rooftops first, then the streets, then finally the garden behind the mansion, revealing patches of grass that looked timid after months of hiding. By the time Thomas was fully discharged from the hospital, the first warm breeze had swept across the city, carrying with it a feeling of renewal that touched everything it passed. Lily clung to her mother's hand as they waited for him outside the hospital doors. She wore a new red coat, a gift he had insisted on buying for her, and her cheeks flushed with anticipation and nervous excitement. She had visited him every day, but today felt different. Today he was coming home, and she couldn't help but feel responsible for the fact that he was alive to do so. When he stepped outside, supported only slightly by a cane, Lily's entire face lit up. She didn't run to him, trying to remember the rules her mother taught her about not startling adults recovering from illness, but she did take a few eager steps forward. Thomas saw her immediately and smiled, a real smile, not forced by politeness or dulled by exhaustion, but warm and full of gratitude. He extended his hand toward her, and she walked to him without hesitation. The drive back to the mansion felt strangely peaceful. Thomas rode in the back seat, Lily beside him and her mother in the front. Lily leaned close, watching the city pass by through the window, occasionally turning to check if Thomas was comfortable or needed anything. Her care didn't go unnoticed. He found himself marveling at how naturally she cared for others, without being asked, without wanting anything in return. It reminded him of a simpler time in his own childhood, long before business, power, and betrayal hardened pieces of his heart. He wondered how often he had forgotten that compassion still existed in the world. When they arrived at the mansion, the staff gathered outside, greeting him with relieved smiles. Many had worried about his health, and even those who didn't know him well seemed genuinely glad to see him return. Lily stayed close to his side, watching everything with wide eyes, feeling strangely protective of him despite her size. He placed a hand on her shoulder as they walked inside, steadying himself while also letting everyone know she belonged there now, not as a staff child, but as someone important to him. Over the next weeks, the household changed in ways Lily could barely comprehend. The tension that once lingered after Jake's betrayal faded, replaced by a quiet sense of unity. Thomas had dismissed several staff members who had been loyal to Jake or complicit in covering for him. In their place he brought in warm, patient, trustworthy people who treated Lily with kindness instead of indifference. Her mother's workload was reduced, and she was given more freedom and higher pay, which left her stunned and grateful each day she walked through the mansion. Lily, meanwhile, spent more and more time in the library, reading, learning, asking questions. Thomas often joined her, sitting in the armchair by the window while she curled up on the rug with her books. Their conversations were never rushed. She would ask him about the stories she read or about the world outside the mansion, and he answered with patience, explaining things in simple words she could understand. The more time they spent together, the clearer it became that something unspoken but profound connected them. He wasn't trying to replace anyone, and she wasn't trying to fill a void, yet they instinctively reached for each other in moments of fear or joy, as if their bond had grown roots without either of them noticing. The day her acceptance letter to the prestigious private academy arrived, Thomas insisted that she open it in the library. Lily carefully tore the envelope, her hands shaking with excitement and uncertainty. When she read the first lines, her eyes grew wide before she slowly looked up at him. "They want me," she whispered, almost unable to believe it. Thomas chuckled softly and lifted her into a gentle hug, telling her that he never doubted her for a second. Her mother cried quietly in the corner, overwhelmed that her daughter, a child who had once been overlooked and underestimated, now had a future she could never have imagined on her own. But the moment that defined everything came a week later, during a small celebration dinner Thomas had arranged. There were no fancy guests, no reporters, just a handful of close staff and the three of them seated at the head of the table. Lily wore a simple new dress, one that matched her bright smile, and Thomas watched her with a fondness he no longer tried to hide. Midway through the meal, Lily set down her fork and looked up at him with an expression far too serious for a child. Her mother noticed but stayed quiet, allowing the moment to unfold. "Mr. Harrington," Lily said softly, her voice filled with nervous bravery, "are you happy now?" Thomas paused, taken aback by the question. It held more weight than many things adults had asked him over the years. He studied her small face, her curious eyes, the innocence that had saved him. He sighed deeply, feeling a warmth settle in his chest as he answered honestly. "Yes, Lily," he said. "I am happier than I've been in a very long time." Lily nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer, and reached across the table to take his hand. Her fingers were tiny against his, but the strength in them was unmistakable. Thomas squeezed her hand gently, acknowledging a truth that no longer needed hiding. She wasn't just the housekeeper's daughter anymore. She was family, not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by something stronger than circumstance. As the evening ended and Lily's laughter echoed through the mansion, Thomas leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought of the near tragedy he had survived, the darkness Jake had brought into his life, and the small voice that had saved him. And for the first time in many years, he didn't feel alone. He felt grounded, hopeful, connected to something pure. The man who once believed his best years were behind him now felt the quiet promise of new beginnings. And the little girl who had once stood trembling in a hallway now walked through the mansion with confidence, knowing she belonged. Their lives had collided in a way neither could have predicted, shaped by betrayal, truth, and bravery. But what grew from that collision was something far more powerful, a bond that would carry them into a future brighter than either had imagined. And as spring's sunlight filled the library the next morning, painting warm golden pools across the floor, Lily sat beside him with her new schoolbooks, swinging her legs and reading aloud. Thomas listened, a soft smile on his face. For the first time in years, the world felt exactly as it should.